Imagine a world where the most powerful nation doesn't expand its empire through conquest, colonies, or force but through something far more invisible and far more brilliant: debt. Picture endless conveyor belts of freshly printed dollars rolling off machines in Washington, while across the ocean, skyscrapers rise in Shanghai, oil rigs spin in the Middle East, and factories in Europe hum with life all powered by that same American paper. Now imagine this. Every time America borrows, the world becomes more dependent on it. Every crisis that should have weakened the United States has, instead, strengthened its global grip. So here is the unsettling question that sets the tone for everything you're about to discover. How did America convince the entire planet to accept its debt and trade it for their own economic security? To understand this paradox, we must step back and look at the global system through a different lens. Most countries suffer when they borrow too much. Their currencies fall, inflation rises, investors flee. But America? It became the richest and most dominant superpower in history because it borrowed, because the world uses its currency. Because U.S. Treasury bonds, the very symbol of its debt, are treated like gold in global markets. Nations store them, banks rely on them, governments trust them. And every time the United States prints more dollars or issues more debt, it doesn't lose power. It exports inflation, imports cheap goods, and tightens its financial influence. This video will take you inside the mechanics, the secrets, and the global deals that built this system. From the moment the dollar became the world's anchor after World War II, to the shock that ended gold convertibility, to the petrodollar agreement that forced every nation on Earth to buy energy in US dollars, to the hidden pipelines that send America's debt overseas and bring power back home. What you're about to see isn't just economics, it's geopolitics, strategy, and quiet domination. It's how the American financial empire was built, not on soldiers or missiles, but on the world's willingness to trust a green piece of paper. And once you understand this system, you'll see that America's greatest export is not technology. It's not entertainment, not even military power. Its detand behind that debt is the true engine of global influence. The only question that remains is, how long can this system last before the world demands something different? After World War II, the world was in ruins. Economies had collapsed, currencies had lost value, and nations desperately needed stability. Into this chaos stepped the United States, whose factories were untouched by war, whose gold reserves were the largest in history, and whose political influence was rising. In 1944, at a small town in New Hampshire called Bretton Woods, 44 allied nations gathered to reshape the global financial system. They needed a currency strong enough to rebuild world trade, stable enough to restore trust, and abundant enough to finance reconstruction. Only one candidate met all those conditions: the US dollar. But the deal came with a promise. The United States agreed that every dollar circulating around the world could be converted into gold, fixed at $35 an ounce. This made the dollar as good as gold, and countries began hoarding it as a safe international reserve. Global trade, loans, investments, and reconstruction plans all began moving through dollars. European nations rebuilt using American money. Japan's growth depended on U.S. financing. Latin American governments borrowed dollars to modernize. As dollars flowed overseas, something extraordinary happened. The U.S. discovered it could shape world economies simply by controlling its currency. Other nations relied on dollar stability. America relied on their dependence. This was the quiet beginning of the U.S. financial empire, the moment the dollar stopped being just a national currency and became the backbone of the global economy. Power had shifted not through force, but through trust in American money. By the late 1960s, cracks began to appear in the Bretton Woods system. The U.S. was spending heavily on the Vietnam War, the space race, and an expanding domestic economy. So many dollars were flowing overseas that foreign governments started doubting whether the U.S. actually had enough gold to back them. Countries, especially France, under Charles de Gaulle, began demanding gold in exchange for their dollar reserves. Plane loads of gold were literally flown out of America to fulfill these requests. Behind closed doors, U.S. officials panicked. If every country demanded gold simultaneously, the entire U.S. financial system could collapse. Something drastic had to be done. And on August 15, 1971, President Richard Nixon delivered the shock that reshaped global finance forever. He announced that the United States would temporarily suspend the dollar's convertibility into gold. In reality, the gold window was shut permanently. The reaction was immediate. World leaders were stunned. Economists predicted the collapse of the dollar. Critics called it the end of American credibility. But something unexpected happened. Instead of falling, the dollar remained the center of the global financial system. Why? Because countries were already too dependent on it. International trade was priced in dollars. Debt was issued in dollars. Central banks held dollars as reserves. Abandoning the dollar meant destabilizing themselves. And so the world accepted a new reality. The U.S. could print money without the constraint of gold. The dollar was now backed not by metal, but by global trust and U.S. political power. America had quietly upgraded its financial weapon. After the gold standard ended, the world asked a critical question: what gives the dollar value now? Without gold backing, the dollar needed a new anchor, something universal, something every nation needed, something that would guarantee permanent global demand. That anchor turned out to be oil. In the early 1970s, the U.S. made a historic deal with Saudi Arabia, the world's largest oil producer. The agreement was simple but groundbreaking. Saudi Arabia would sell oil only in U.S. dollars. In return, America would provide military protection, advanced weapons, and political support. Soon, other OPEC nations followed the same model. From that moment, if any country wanted to buy oil, the lifeblood of modern civilization, they needed U.S. dollars first. Whether it was Japan fueling its factories, Germany powering its industries, or India meeting its growing energy needs, all had no choice but to increase their dollar reserves. This created a permanent, unstoppable global demand for American currency. But the genius of the petrodollar system went deeper. After countries bought oil with dollars, many of those dollars flowed back into the United States in the form of investments, treasury bonds, real estate, U.S. banks. America was effectively recycling dollars, exporting them through trade, and receiving them back through financial markets. The U.S. could now run massive deficits without fear. This system made the dollar indispensable. It turned American debt into a global necessity and gave the U.S. leverage over any nation reliant on energy, which meant practically everyone. The petrodollar became the hidden engine of American influence. While most countries strive to pay off debt, America does something radically different. It exports its debt to the world, and the world willingly buys it. The mechanism is surprisingly simple, yet incredibly powerful. First, the United States prints dollars or issues treasury bonds. These dollars flow into global markets through imports, military spending abroad, and international investments. Countries receiving those dollars face a choice: hold them as cash or reinvest them back into the American system, and almost always they reinvest. Nations like China, Japan, and Germany take the dollars they earn from exporting goods to the U.S. and use them to buy U.S. Treasury bonds, the very essence of American debt. Why? Because U.S. debt is considered the safest financial asset on earth. If a country holds U.S. bonds, it has liquidity, security, and access to global markets. Central banks accumulate them to stabilize their currencies, protect themselves during recessions, and maintain economic credibility. This creates a cycle. The U.S. prints money, gives the world, accepts it, gives the world, sends it back, gives the U.S., spends more. America receives real goods, electronics, cars, oil, machinery, while the world receives American promises to repay. The U.S. consumes, other nations produce. Yet global economies are locked into this system because abandoning U.S. debt would destabilize their own currencies. In essence, America discovered a unique advantage. It can borrow cheaply, spend freely, and build influence, because its debt has become the foundation of global finance. No empire in history has enjoyed a privilege like this. American debt isn't just a financial instrument, it's a geopolitical weapon. By anchoring the world to the dollar, the United States gained extraordinary control over the global system. One of the clearest examples is sanctions. When the U.S. decides to punish a country, it can freeze its dollar transactions, block access to the SWIFT banking network, or restrict U.S. bank operations. Since nearly all major international transactions pass through America's financial system at some point, being cut off is economically devastating. But the influence goes even deeper. The International Monetary Fund and the World Bank institutions, heavily shaped by U.S. policy, offer loans, primarily in dollars. Countries in crisis depend on these institutions for survival, and that dependence often comes with strategic conditions. Nations align their political or economic policies to maintain access to dollar-based funding. Furthermore, global corporations price major commodities, oil, wheat, metals in dollars. This means countries must keep large reserves of U.S. currency, reinforcing America's central role. Even military alliances are linked to the dollar system. Many nations cooperate with U.S. interests, partly because their economic stability relies on dollar-denominated trade and finance. This silent influence allows America to project global power without deploying troops. The dollar becomes the invisible chain connecting economies to Washington. Countries may dislike U.S. policies, but they fear the consequences of losing access to dollar markets even more. In the modern world, money is often more powerful than missiles, and the U.S. controls the strongest currency ever created. For decades, American dominance through the dollar has seemed unshakable. But today, the world is beginning to question how long this system can last. U.S. national debt has crossed unprecedented levels, and every year trillions more are added. Critics argue that no empire can borrow forever without consequences. Meanwhile, rising powers, especially China, Russia, and the BRICS alliance, are exploring alternatives. They conduct trade in local currencies, experiment with digital payment systems, and accumulate gold reserves. Some countries fear the political leverage the U.S. holds through the dollar. They worry about being sanctioned or cut off from global banking systems. This has led to discussions about de-dollarization. It's the idea of reducing reliance on the American financial architecture. Yet despite these efforts, the dollar remains unrivaled. No other currency has the liquidity, trust, stability, or global acceptance required to replace it. China's yuan lacks transparency and political freedom. The euro struggles with union-wide debt issues. Cryptocurrencies are too volatile. Gold is stable but impractical for modern trade. So the world continues using the dollar not because it's perfect, but because every alternative is weaker. Still, this raises a profound question for the future. What happens if global confidence in the U.S. economy fades? What if political instability or massive debt undermines trust? Could the financial empire built on paper begin to crack? For now, the dollar remains king. But history teaches us that no empire lasts forever. The true test will come not from America's strength, but from the world's patience. In the end, the story of America's rise is not just the story of a nation, it is the story of a system the world agreed to participate in. A system built not on conquest, but on confidence. Not on territory, but on trust. For almost a century, the U.S. has turned its greatest weakness into its greatest strength. It prints money, and the world holds it. It spends, and other nations save. It issues promises on paper, and countries treat them as treasure. But beneath this extraordinary design lies a question that grows louder each year. How long can global power rest on the willingness of nations to believe in one currency? History shows that every empire rises on a foundation the world accepts until one day doesn't. For now, the dollar remains the bloodstream of the global economy. It's flowing through every trade port, every central bank, every market, every crisis. And as long as the world needs it, America's influence will endure. But if the day comes when trust weakens, when nations seek alternatives, when technology or politics shifts the balance, then the financial empire built on exported debt may finally face its ultimate test. Until then, America continues to shape the world with the most subtle and powerful tool ever created. A green piece of paper backed by belief, reinforced by systems, and held together by a